Welcome to the DARKSTREAM. Voxday, voxday.blogspot.com, and unauthorized.tv. Sorry, I am a little bit later than I'd anticipated in that my computer made the irritating decision to update when I rebooted, preparatory to doing a stream. I always like to be working off of a fresh boot when I'm streaming, just to reduce the number of likely errors and so forth. So if the volume is low, turn your volume up. That's really all I can advise at the moment. Otherwise people complain that it's too loud. So anyhow, it's already set to like 8. So anyhow, it's only playing left side audio. Okay, maybe I hit something incorrectly here. Monitor. And I don't know. But I'm not going to sit around and I'm not actually. It's also entirely possible that this update did something, because I didn't change anything. Let's see here. This is always fun. Mixer is, everything looks pretty set to the center. So anyhow, we'll just have to look into it later, and deal with it for now. We can just go microphone mono mix. We can try that. Copy left to right. I don't even know what their yeah. Let's see. Does this make any difference? Let me know if that makes any difference. It muted. Okay, well, that's not going to work. So, all right. Anyhow, we'll just have to deal with it. I don't know what's going on. Oh, it did. Okay, never mind. I'll go back to doing that. Settings. I turned it off. Okay, that should work. So anyhow, that's the risk of when you reboot, because then you get these exciting new changes. So anyhow, art of conflict. What do I mean by the art of conflict? Well, I'm thinking both in terms of the disappointment that everybody has with regards to the whole situation with President Trump, the situation with Q, all the, trust the plan, what was the plan, there is no plan, all this sort of thing. But yeah, I've been thinking about how that relates to what I've learned in reading some books recently on the Battle of Waterloo. A very good book called The Battle by, I think it's Barbero, the Italian historian, military historian. And also reflecting on what I see as some of the mistakes and some of the successes that the Legal Legion has had in its various legal conflicts. And one of the things that I think that is vital to understand is that the truism that no battle plan survives contact with the enemy, and the fact that everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face, as Mike Tyson says, is that even those who are considered to be legitimately the greatest strategists of all time understand the limits of strategy and understand the limits of planning. You can't just stick to the plan because there are too many variables involved. It was really interesting to read about the way that Napoleon went about figuring out how he was going to make his attack on the Wellington's position on the hills of Waterloo. And first of all, keeping in mind, we're talking about somebody who is both a strategic and a logistical genius. And it occurs to me that the most important lesson that Napoleon teaches is speed. The speed of your action, the speed of your reactions, the decisiveness with which you make decisions. That was always a big advantage for him. Same thing with Caesar. We've been watching, Space Bunny and I have been watching HBO's Rome recently, and it's quite good. I frankly always thought that it was a bad joke, but it turns out that I was thinking mostly about a show called Spartacus, which I saw a very brief bit of and hated. But Rome is actually interesting, and even though some of the portrayals are, I think, a little bit questionable, the fact of the speed of Caesar's movement completely throwing off and changing the balance of power between him and Pompey was very illustrative of the mistakes that the Legal Legion made when it came to dealing with Patreon. If you just look at what they did, they had at least 2 weeks to get the arbitrations filed in between the time that Patreon changed the terms of use and when those terms of use came into effect. That lack of speed, that lack of decisiveness, made the whole lawsuit possible. If they had followed through and filed the arbitration sooner, then it would not have been possible. Well, actually, that's not quite fair. It's possible that Patreon would have followed suit and filed the lawsuit anyhow, but not necessarily. And so, certainly their case would have been weaker. Another thing but here's the interesting thing. Let's go back to Napoleon a bit. Napoleon did not know how he was going to array his forces, and he had no idea what was going to be the focal point of his attack until the morning of the battle, until day had dawned. In fact, he did not even know, he was not certain that Wellington's army was going to stick around. There was a very good chance that they were going to retreat to Brussels. They had just 2 days before lost the Battle of Quatre Bras. I'm mispronouncing that, of course. The Battle of the Four Corners, the intersections. And a lot of people believed that Wellington was going to retreat to Brussels. And so he was looking, he was hoping that they would stay. In fact, he said at the beginning of the dawn that they had 90 chances in 100 to win. And if you look at the way that he then arrayed his forces and then he moved in, he didn't know where he was going to make the focus of his attack. The whole point was to send the scouts in, send the skirmishers in, feel out the defenses, and then make the decision and make the push. And so, there's something that is very much to be said for that, because if you look at the way that things change once the conflict actually begins, then you can almost certainly anticipate that at some point in time you are going to make a mistake, and at some point in time your opponent is going to make a mistake. And the key is, if you are not able to give yourself a sufficient advantage at the beginning, enough to allow you to completely overwhelm your opponent and win easily. And generally you can't. As Sun Tzu says, only the absolute greatest commanders and the greatest strategists and so forth are capable of winning without even engaging in conflict. That's the optimal result. But that very seldom happens. And that's the big mistake, I think, for people that were hung up on the idea that trusting the plan meant that Trump was just going to magically wave his fingers and everything was going to go, suddenly thousands of people were going to be arrested and the economy was going to be fixed and all that sort of thing. I don't believe that sort of thing was ever in the cards. And I made it very clear when every time people would bring up things like Nisara, Jasara, etc., etc., I said, no, that's not credible. Not in the way that people are talking about. Now, I did think, and perhaps it's because my own imagination is too limited, I did think that there was a reason for Trump to act while he was in office. If I had been in his position, that's what I would have done. One thing that Rome illustrates rather nicely is that holding Rome was the key. Holding Rome was very important to both Pompey and the Senate and to Caesar, and it was Pompey's decision to retreat from Rome, thinking that they could easily come back and take it, that turned out to be potentially a fatal decision for him. Pompey was just thinking in terms of, well, we just need time to get our greater numbers together, but by giving up that position, whatever advantage he had coming from that was soon overwhelmed by the strategic advantage of being in possession of Rome. Possession, as they say, being 9/10 of the law. Now, Wellington, somebody said, well, what were Wellington's strengths? Wellington is arguably the greatest general of all time. And he's somewhat unfairly maligned because people say that, oh, well, he was just a really great defensive general. Well, that's not true. He just was very, very seldom in a position where he could go on the offensive. But when he did, he inevitably won and was inevitably successful. But what Wellington teaches is actually very, very similar to the approach that the Legal Legion has taken, which is you must always shore up your flanks and always assume a very, very strong defensive position. It's very difficult. For example, it's very difficult for these companies. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about Uber, whether you're talking about DoorDash, whether you're talking about Indiegogo. All of these companies put themselves in horrifically bad strategic positions because they set up a system where the other side simply cannot be harmed. And of course, that's why they all are very focused on escaping from arbitration in the way that Patreon, for example, has completely exited it. And so it's a bit ironic because there's a perfectly good solution, a better solution that they could easily embrace. All of these companies could easily embrace, and yet none of them does so, despite the fact that it's something that jams used to actually require. So anyhow, but the key thing is what Wellington always did is he made sure that it was very, very difficult, not impossible, because it did happen on occasion that his flanks failed him, but that it was very, very difficult to lose the flank, to be taken in the rear, etc., etc. Yeah, Sir Hamster makes a good point. The Roman army built a base camp every single day. Every single day that they marched, they would stop early enough in the afternoon. They could dig ditches, build up, chop down trees, and build a veritable fortress in the middle of nowhere just to protect themselves. And so what we learn from the Romans, what we learn from Wellington, is that if you're going to engage in conflict, it's always vital to make sure that you're in a solid, defensible position. And another thing that we learned is that don't get cute. I think the worst element the worst example of getting cute is Hitler in World War II and his belief in Wunderwaffen, wonder weapons, super technology, a way that you're going to surprise the other side and win through surprise. Well, guess what? There's very, very few examples of anybody ever winning anything through surprise. Surprise just gives you an advantage. But that advantage is very, very seldom anything that is sufficient to allow you to win, because whether you're talking about people, whether you're talking about corporations, whether you're talking about nations, whether you're talking about militaries, they're all much more resilient than people tend to think. I mean, Russia is the perfect example of resiliency. Here Napoleon goes in, wins some battles, actually takes the capital city, and expects that he's won. But he's won nothing. And he's forced to retreat, driven out, and returns to France with a bare fraction of his forces. That's you can argue about whether Hitler's mistake was on a similar scale. I don't think so, because there was enough evidence. It's not conclusive, but there was enough evidence that the Soviets were planning to attack Nazi Germany, and certainly they were going to at some point in time, that you can at least understand where that came from, even if you think that it was a very foolish decision and poorly executed. But Napoleon's decision, there's just no excuse for it. There's no need for it. And so, that's one of the more significant mistakes in history, because certainly European history would have proceeded in a very different fashion if, at the height of their power, the French hadn't thrown their complete advantage away and destroyed their military. Sir Hamster points out that famous infographic of the size of Napoleon's army as it invaded and retreated, and it's really remarkable. So we talked about speed, we talked about defenses. Let's go back to the point about mistakes. You're going to make mistakes. They're going to make mistakes. So the key is recognizing your own mistakes and counteracting them, shoring up whatever gaps you've exposed, versus exploiting the mistakes made by the other side. And it's interesting because sometimes mistakes can be made from positions of strength. What people are doing can actually, and finding success with, can actually lead them into significant errors. The British heavy cavalry is the best example. At Waterloo, as in the Spanish Peninsular War, they were initially very successful, completely drove off the enemy, but instead of securing their victory, they went too far. And in going too far, they not only got themselves killed, but they ended up leaving a gap in the line that could have been exploited. Now, it wasn't successfully exploited because the British infantry managed to hold its squares. So even though the French cavalry, after having driven off the British cavalry, was roaming freely through the British lines, they couldn't do anything. So that was an example of both the mistake made by success, but Wellington shoring up the gap and shoring up the gap made by that mistake by the superior discipline of his infantry. Even so, it was a very close run thing. Yeah, somebody said, is China's unrestricted warfare a good example of winning without fighting? It appears to be so far. They certainly appear to be very successful so far. They've completely managed to modify the military balance of power that used to be dominated by the United States military, to the point now that the Chinese military is larger than the US military, and increasingly has the ability to keep the US out of its zone of influence, in much the same way that the US eventually developed the power to keep the European powers out of its zone of influence in the New World. You may recall the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine is actually very similar to the announcements that the Chinese have made about the South China Sea. The Monroe Doctrine was the US saying, look, Britain, look, France, look, Germany, our Navy is now sufficiently powerful that we're not going to permit you to come in here and dominate the South American and Central American countries the way that you used to be able to. So, I do suspect, we don't know yet. We don't know enough about what's happening. This whole, there's theories that the whole COVID thing was faked in order to set up the vaccine as a genetic marker that can be targeted by subsequent viruses and stuff. We'll get into that some other time. That's kind of what I would call the 7 kill scenario, and hopefully it's wrong. You can see the link on my blog to Carl Denninger's site. He talks about that. Keeping in mind, Carl does tend to be a little bit on the dramatic side. He also tends to be on the pessimistic side. So I wouldn't get too wrapped up in it, too caught up in it, too carried away. But it is a possibility. And we cannot allow ourselves to divert our minds away from possibilities that are legitimate, even if we happen to find them terrifying or upsetting or anything else. Yeah, and certainly it's a little bit difficult to point to the quality of the United States military, because they no longer have the population that they used to have. It's now a very diverse population rather than a homogenous European population. And it's also a significantly different relationship from a industrial point of view. The U.S. in World War II had the ability to outproduce all the rest of the world. Now China has the ability to outproduce the United States. And so the math, the demographics are now in the U.S., or they're now no longer in the U.S. favor. It's now in China's favor. So, anyhow, it's, these are interesting times, as I say. It's actually fascinating to watch, even if it's infuriating at times to see the idiocy that's going on, even if it's upsetting at times to see the way that the wicked prosper, and to be disappointed when we don't see, shall we say, the plan playing out the way that we think it should. But remember, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It doesn't mean that it's still not in effect in some way. Remember what I told you. Both sides get a vote. Both sides take action. And there's enough anomalies out there that I don't think that the whole situation is clear. I definitely don't think the whole situation is over. But the other thing is, nothing's ever really over per se. Anyhow, that's all I have time for tonight. So we'll talk some more about the art of conflict in the future. I was really just wanting to get some thoughts out. I'd had some conversations with some of the Legal Legion guys over the weekend, and I just finished reading the book about Waterloo, and it was just interesting to me to see the synchronicities between 19th century military history and 21st century legal conflict. I mean, who would have thought that there were so many parallels that were so obvious? So perhaps you'll find this useful to you. If not, have a good evening anyhow. I'm Vox Day. This is the Dark Stream.